Madam Chair, you're live.
All right, welcome everybody to the January 21 meeting of the House Energy and Digital Infrastructure Committee. We are here with the chair of the PUC, Ed McNamara, and as per our custom, we'll quickly go around the room and introduce ourselves. We like folks in the room to introduce themselves and who they're representing. And then we'll allow you to introduce yourself for the record. And I just wanted to mention that we are a committee who likes to ask a lot of questions. And we have a hard stop at 2:15 so that we can take a little break and get to another meeting that we have at 2:30. So, all right, so I'm Kathleen James from Manchester.
Scott Gamble from St. Johnsbury.
Rich Bailey from Hyde Park.
Chris Morrow, Weston.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Dara Torrey, Washington 2.
Graham Kleppner, Burlington.
Jonathan Walton, Permanent Piper, in the room on behalf of Burlington Electric Department, Mumford Power Supply Authority, and the smaller independent telephone companies like Franklin and Waitsfield Shelburne.
Great.
Mike Murphy in the room on behalf of Downtown Martin.
Jeremy Little in the room on behalf of the Vermont Chamber of Commerce.
Jacqueline Frazier on behalf of Moran Strategy.
Peter Sterling, Renewable Energy Vermont.
All right.
Great. Ed McNamara, Chair of the Public Utility Commission. So Jack, how do you want to do this?
I emailed you a link.
Great, thank you. Apologies for not doing this in advance.
No problem. Thank you for being here. Actually, as long as we have a minute. DRM, are you representing a particular client today?
Not that I'm sure I am.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah,
I'm just new to it, so I don't know.
that's where I'm at. New to this, so I'm sure I am, but I don't know who it is.
Great. Well, I'll take a lot of notes.
Yes.
Laura Svilia, Winter 2.
All right. We're just waiting to get the slides up.
You should be able to share your screen.
Yeah. Jack, can you just share it from the website? Is that easier or no?
Here you go.
All right.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
All right, so I'm going to provide a quick overview. Well, maybe not so quick. I'll try to provide a quick overview. Who we are, what we do, industries we regulate, and some general principles as well that sort of inform all our regulatory thinking. So quickly, who we are. Just for context, every single state has some version of a PUC. The name is going to be different in almost every state, and the structure and the jurisdiction. For example, Washington State, regulates ferries. Massachusetts had a really large proceeding all about Uber and whether it should be regulated because they have some regulation of taxis. So I'll talk about what we do, but it is going to be different in every single state. So why do we actually have this? Why do we have this structure of PUC? Monopoly utilities. And the underlying concept is that they need to be regulated to promote the public interest.
It's okay.
That means you're powered. Yeah, I'm sorry.
To the point.
So, railroads. We actually started as the Vermont Railroad Commission in 1855. And then we didn't really start regulating electric utilities until early 1900s. Historical side note, if anyone's a environmental history nerd, George Perkins Marsh was one of the earliest railroad commissioners. So, grain silos seems like a random thing to put on a slide, but that was the first time when the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and said that businesses that are affected with a public interest should be regulated. They're not just every other commercial interest. So that was, 1876. So grain silos were actually some of the first regulation we actually had in the first monopoly. Yes,
So the definition of utilities feels very broad to me.
it's extremely broad. I'm sorry, grain silos wouldn't have been considered a utility necessarily, but they would have been considered a monopoly and therefore
Okay.
effectively regulated. So,
Very interesting.
yeah, I didn't dig into difference between utility versus monopoly. I mean, there's,
No, that's okay. It just caught my eye. And so I'm a history buff. So,
Can I ask a question?
yeah, Rep. Sebelia.
Who decides?
who decides what we regulate?
Yeah.
You folks do.
Thank you.
To a large degree, I'll get into a caveat about federal government in a little bit.
Okay.
So we really started off as just a bunch of economic nerds, economic regulations, all we did. And in some states, that's all the PUCs still do. Most of the country, though, a lot of the states started evolving. So they took on these broader, sort of non-economic regulation components. Renewable energy standards is one great example, but even before that, in the 1980s, Vermont PUC started looking at environmental externalities and accounting for environmental externalities when they looked at power supply mix. One other, to me, important distinction between us and most other state PUCs, we have a much more significant role in siting generation than almost any other state PUC. I was talking to a colleague in Massachusetts, and they only get involved in, I think it was specifically solar siting, if it's at least 100 megawatts. We have nothing anywhere close to that. 20 megawatts is our largest solar, so they wouldn't regulate anything, at least what we have in our state. Again, every state varies, and that's a decision of the legislature. So quickly, there's 3 commissioners, staggered 6-year terms. In terms of appointments, we're all reviewed by Judicial Nominating Committee, appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. We have a clerk's office, or our clerk is responsible for communicating with all the parties in cases. We'll talk a little bit about ex parte communication later. She's got a deputy clerk, 3 administrative staff, and we have hearing officers. They're the ones who actually do the vast majority of our cases. We have a couple hundred cases at any given time, and typically it's these hearing officers who do the bulk of that work associated with the case. 8 attorneys, 7 analysts, and then we have director of operations and business manager. Something I forgot to put on the slide. Our director of operations was instrumental in creating something called EPUC. It's a case management system. I'm not going to say it's the most intuitive system. There's no such thing as an intuitive case management system, but it is possible for anyone who wants to be able to log on and see all the case files electronically very easily if you have a web browser.
Rep. Sebelia.
Yeah, Madam Chair, actually, all the years I've been on the Energy Committee and heard PUC 101s, I don't know that we've ever done a walkthrough of EPUC, and I think that might be helpful at some point, both for the committee and for the public, to just understand how to log on and how to navigate that system. I don't know if that's something that, I mean, there's a lot there in terms
There
of
is a lot
public
there.
comment and.
Chair McNamara, if you'd be willing to come back sometime, and I think it might be interesting, let us know.
Yeah, we, I'm saying we, not me, are definitely not the best person to do it. So we have some of our folks who are really good at it. We can definitely do that.
I think that'd be interesting. Thank you.
Great. So funding, most of our funding comes from gross receipts tax, and this is paid by the companies that we regulate, represents about 93% of our budget. We get relatively small amount through application fees. So anybody who develops, I should say, merchant generation and merchant storage. So the electric utilities pay the gross receipts tax. So if they're building a solar project, they don't pay the application fee. The application, they're funding us through the gross receipts tax. So the application fee is paid for by developers of generation and storage. It's about 6% of our budget. Build back is just a fancy term of if we have some one-off cases and we have a court reporter, we tell whoever filed that petition, you have to pay for the court reporter. So we pay the upfront costs and then bill back to the petitioner. Relatively small dollar amounts overall, less than 1%. Another factor as well is that electric usage, gas usage, pretty much everything fluctuates over time, mostly depending on weather. And so that means our revenues are fluctuating over time. So we have a reserve fund that we're able to sort of cushion as well. Otherwise, we have some interesting budget issues. We are not funded through general fund. The one-time exception was for one fiscal year for 3 staff associated with clean heat. That was the only time we received general fund for staffing. Apologies, did you have Department of Public Service come in and provide an overview? Can't remember.
Kind of.
Okay.
We're gonna have a do-over on that.
All right. So this is just really to explain a little bit of the difference. We're quasi-judicial. We're independent of the administration. And then I'll talk a little bit later about what adjudicative and legislative means, just sort of what our functions are. And then Vermonters participate in proceedings before us. Distinct from Department of Public Service, that is an executive branch agency. They represent the public interest in all proceedings before us. They also do long-term planning, both on energy and telecommunications. They work with customers to resolve complaints before they come to us. And they also have a role interacting with U.S. Department of Energy, which has been particularly significant in the years of IRA and other federal funding. So moving into what we actually regulate. I gave that caveat about generally you folks get to tell us what to do unless the federal government says otherwise. So we're responsible for retail rates. Retail is just end use customers. So each of you is an end use customer, your electric bill, that's the retail. We're responsible for overseeing any distribution planning. Mentioned earlier, citing generation, and we also cite transmission, even though we have limited rate regulation over the transmission costs. We're responsible for citing it if it gets built. And then generation portfolio, what I really mean here is what's the makeup of what kind of generation do we need to have? Think specifically of renewable energy standard. You're essentially, the legislature has told the utilities we want X amount, this type of generation, Y amount, this type of generation. That's something that states have always had control over. On the federal side, wholesale rates, and this is primarily whatever the prices the utility pays to generation or to transmission owners. So that's wholesale. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission are the ones who are responsible for everything on the right side of the page here. Transmission planning, you're going to hear, I believe, later this week from ISO New England. They actually administer the transmission planning, but they're regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Transmission costs are also regulated on the federal level. And prices paid to generation with some significant caveats I'm going to move to next.
Can you explain that a little bit more, prices paid to generation?
Yeah, so actually, if you can
Sure.
let's jump right to the next page. So what I mean by prices paid to a generator is if you have a 20 megawatt solar project and they have a contract with Connecticut utility, even though the facility is located in Vermont, the price that the Connecticut utility pays to the 20 megawatt generator is actually theoretically or is regulated by FERC. The way that FERC does regulation though of generation prices is they have a wholesale market. So they let the market effectively set the price. So FERC oversees the market rules. ISO New England administers the prices, or sorry, administers the market. And generators typically receive whatever prices come out of that market. Really important caveat though, a large portion of generators have long-term power supply agreements. So in other words, a contract for 20, 25 years where the price is not set by the market directly. It's the utility and the generator agree we're going to get 8 cents a kilowatt hour for every kilowatt hour that we produce over 25 years, some kind of escalators, those kind of things. So a lot of what we see nowadays, especially on the renewable side, are long-term contracts. The price that is set though, or the price in the contract, typically dovetails with the expected wholesale market prices. So in other words, the utility isn't going to pay 20 cents a kilowatt hour for a solar project when they know if they went into the wholesale market, they could get the same power for 5 cents and then the renewable energy credits on top. Sorry, this is digging in deep. So ISO New England is going to present. What I'd suggest is have them dig into that piece. I'm happy to come back later and provide some more real world examples.
Okay.
But we could easily spend, I'll just say my job for a couple of years. I spent probably about 20 hours a week working on wholesale market, and it is a ridiculously dense subject.
Rick Campbell, yeah.
Working without getting dense about it, I'm just wondering about, you said that FERC sets the market rules and ISO New England administers that, and basically setting the prices for generators, but in-state generators for power that's used in state, is that true for that as well, or is that?
This is the next piece. Okay. Next part of the slide here. There's two exceptions to when the state can actually regulate or set the prices paid to generators. First is net metering, and the reason for that, federal government usually gets involved with interstate commerce. With net metering, theoretically, if you produce power here, it's actually used right there as well. That's the underlying concept. And so it never becomes interstate, entirely an intrastate issue. And FERC has specifically said we're staying out of net metering. That's up to you states. The other is qualifying facilities. Again, this is a little getting in the weeds. There is Public Utilities Regulatory Policy Act, late 1970s during the oil crisis. U.S. Congress looked at ways to reduce reliance on oil. And so what they essentially said is utilities, you have to open up your transmission assets. Let any of these merchant projects, which were still fairly new back then, interconnect into your transmission system as long as they're cogeneration, so more efficient, or renewable. And there was a size cap, and at this point it's 20 megawatts effectively. So standard offer program is essentially a PERPA compliant program, and that's why we are able to set the prices.
Okay, great. We don't have to go any deeper than that. Thanks.
All right.
but there's a quiz.
Just on acronyms. All right. I'm going to talk a little bit now about what the sectors that we regulate, and I'm just going to try to fly through this fairly quickly in terms of what we actually regulate, because there's a lot. So electric sector, I should also do a disclaimer. I am an electricity nerd. I've been doing this for a really long time. When it gets to telecom, I know some folks have particular interest. I know Maria Royal is going to be talking later as well. I'm happy to have the folks who are really good at that from my shop come in. It's not going to be me. I'm going to be focusing much more on the electric side because what I know really well. So tariffs. Tariffs is just a fancy word for the offerings that utility provides. So you all take service under tariffs, probably residential 1 tariff, and that simply sets it's both the rate that you pay, roughly 20 cents kilowatt hour, and Green Mountain Power, and also the terms of service as well. So that's the end use customers, and then there's a tariff for net metering rates as well. The utility offers net metering through a tariff. Mentioned before siting. Interconnection is slightly different. It's usually considered within the same bucket, or it's often considered at the same time that we do siting, generation, or transmission. But we do have a separate interconnection rule that essentially says if you're interconnecting your generation or storage or whatever it is into the system, you cannot do damage to the system. And so therefore, here's what the utility is required to ask you, the developer, to make sure your system or your generation is not going to negatively impact the system. I'll talk a little bit more later about energy efficiency services. Even though we have efficiency Vermont, technically it's the electric utility, it's the distribution utilities that are required to provide, by law, they're required to provide energy efficiency services. Efficiency Vermont has taken on that role for them effectively. I'll mention a little bit more about integrated resource planning, and then disconnection rules is essentially when a utility can disconnect a customer for non-payment. There's certain rules around that. Can't be during severely cold weather, for example. And there's a certain process that we have for if somebody has a doctor's note. How many times can they use a doctor's note to avoid disconnect before we say no on that? Yes.
If you're going to talk about this later, just tell me. I would be interested in just a little bit of insight into how you guys make your decisions on siting, how that works, you know, certificate of public good, your criteria. I would just, it comes up so often in my.
Yep. Yeah, I do have 2 slides on that a little bit later. So, and on any of this, recognizing we don't have infinite amount of time, if you folks have specific issues you really want me to dig into, I can bring the right people and we can come back.
Okay.
Or you can just call me, reach out, happy to answer questions.
Great.
Natural gas, tariffs very similar in terms of for the electric side, rates paid by the end use customer. They also have to do integrated resource planning. They have to do energy efficiency, disconnects, and siting. So I usually lump natural gas and electric together in terms of the regulation looks very similar. Telecommunications is where we start sort of diverting a little bit. So we have limited regulatory authority in telecommunications. And this is, I actually can't wait to see what Maria says because she knows this better than I do. And by the way, we do have folks that are really good at this. So my ignorance does not reflect the PUCs. Just be really clear. What's that?
I said, that's good, Mr. Chairman.
So we regulate service quality, including outage and repair times. We also do something called, we designate eligible telecommunications companies. There's Universal Service Fund. This helps to support what's called the Lifeline program for low-income Vermonters, so they can access basic telephone service. We're also responsible for siting cell towers as well. In terms of a lot of other typical things on telecommunications, we have very limited regulatory authority when it comes to wireless providers, broadband, and internet service providers. And that largely reflects the fact that those services are heavily, there's a lot of statutes at the federal level around that, and those federal statutes are really aimed at trying to create a competitive environment and ensure a competitive environment for those services. Yes.
Go, you go.
Can you just repeat what you said about low-income internet customers? You have regulatory authority, or you do not?
Sorry, this is telecommunications, so consolidated basic telephone service.
Oh, okay.
There's support for customers with low income to be able to access basic telecommunications. There was a separate program for broadband. It's not something that we have ever regulated.
Okay, thank you.
And so telephone and broadband are not the same.
That's correct.
Right.
Yep.
So.
Yes.
This is back a couple slides. I'm really sorry. So you regulate electric rates.
Yep.
And I saw you regulate natural gas,
Yes.
so VT gas.
PGS. Yep.
But you don't regulate any others. You don't heating fuel is not regulated.
PUC does not do any rate regulation of any heating fuel except for natural gas.
Okay.
Department of Public Service has some safety. They regulate some safety associated, I think, with propane delivery, and then Agency of Natural Resources has some regulation over storage tanks, for example, to prevent leaking, things like that. That'd be environmental focus.
Gotcha. Okay.
Go ahead.
Would that be because it's not infrastructure in the ground that services areas? Is that the main reason?
Yes. It's an interesting question because Vermont Gas has often said that they are not really a monopoly because people can switch to propane, they can switch to oil. Be interesting to sort of dive into that history. I haven't looked at any of those orders in a long, long time, but I think it's largely because Vermont Gas has the pipe, and therefore they're the only ones who can access that pipe. Theoretically, you can, even if you have oil or propane, you can go to different heating providers that provide just oil or just propane. So you're not sort of stuck with one delivery person or one fuel dealer. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Two questions then. In the case of a gas pipeline, can multiple producers produce into a common gas line, such as owned by Vermont Gas, and then separate, I think it's measured in therms, of the quality of gas, and then separate it out on the other end? Is that technical regulation?
It's theoretically possible, and I know that at least in Vermont, we have one farm methane producer that provides gas into PGS's pipeline. I think there might be one additional coming online soon. But, so that's on one end of the system. I don't know, actually, I'm not even sure if anywhere in New England allows you to have that sort of competitive, similar to use of telephone lines, for example. I don't think I've seen that.
So the old Rutland gas systems that were buried, there are none of those left in Vermont, where they would gasify coal or some other product. There are none. I don't know any.
I don't believe there are any left. I know there was one in Barry, Rutland, and a couple others, but I believe those are mostly gone at this point.
And then on the telecommunications, that's solely the wired telecommunication industry and nothing to do with any other means of,
That's correct. We don't do, so the wireless providers, AT&T, Verizon Wireless,
all
we
hardwired, I think you call it consolidated.
consolidated. Yeah. There, and then Shoreham Telecom, there's a couple of wired telecommunications companies in Vermont that we regulate.
Brooke Sebelia?
Do you regulate fiber or DSL?
We do not.
Just copper
Well,
telephone, right?
sorry. If Consolidated Telecommunications Company provides service over fiber, telecommunication service over fiber, phone service, rather than copper, then we would still regulate that service. Even though they're providing telecommunications and potentially broadband over that same fiber.
Right, so if they provide broadband over that fiber, you can regulate that, you can't regulate that broadband.
We cannot regulate that. That's correct.
Is that a state restriction? I'm sorry.
It's fine.
Is that a state restriction or a federal restriction?
I believe that is mostly federal. That's something that I'm more than happy to get. We have one or two folks who are really good on telecom regulations coming.
Go ahead.
Great.
Go. I just finished my hand movement, yeah.
Brain's slow to work. Fidium, will that be under your purview at some point?
I would not expect that. And so Fidium is Consolidated provides telecommunications service to a large portion of Vermont. Fidium is their broadband provider, and we typically do not regulate broadband. There's some federal preemption issues that I don't know well enough to be able to start speaking intelligently about it right now.
Thank you.
Okay, onward.
Great. Cable television. So we provide, we essentially grant franchises. So Comcast, we grant a franchise, there's a handful of other small cable companies as well. We regulate the service quality, the disconnection requirements. We also do the public education and governmental or PEG channels. So we set the funding and also some technical requirements around that. We don't regulate the cable television rates. Believe that is again a function of federal law. And we do not regulate what channels are being offered to customers. So we have heard requests to regulate. Surprisingly.
I learned that after hearing from a very angry constituent a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Something about a football game. Yep.
So even though franchise is effectively a monopoly, you're not able to regulate on rates or consumer protection items. And that's because it's federally preempted.
That is my understanding, yes. And we are able to regulate service quality to some degree. And again, the nuance is going to be a little bit beyond me at the moment. So we also do not regulate satellite television, YouTube TV, any of that still either. So again, we get calls on that, but we don't actually regulate it.
Gotcha. Same separation here on the same strand. If cable is carrying a broadband service,
we do not regulate that broadband.
There's no regulation of that, just like in
That's right.
telephone. If it's coming over a fiber, we're regulating the telephone rates and quality, but not any broadband.
Yeah. For example, Comcast has Xfinity, which is a wireless provider, I think, or sort of and also broadband, or maybe it's actually not a wireless provider. I think it's a wireless provider, and they also use their own broadband as well. I've never quite understood it. So we regulate to some degree Comcast cable service offerings and very little, if anything, on the other side.
Okay, wow.
And I just want to point out, there's a lot of nuance in here, and Marie knows it very well, and I've got a staff attorney who's excellent at it as well. So to the extent you want to dig in, just let me know. Right. Water systems, this actually used to be more significant when I first started at the PUC back in 2002. We only regulate private water systems, so municipal systems and what are called fire districts. Fire districts are basically co-ops. We don't regulate those. We only do rate regulation. We don't really do quality of service there. That's Agency of Natural Resources primarily, because they're regulating under Safe Drinking Water Act. So from EPA down to ANR. And really the quality comes in on the Safe Drinking Water piece. Yes.
Could you define like private water system is versus a municipal system?
Yeah, so if you actually have a housing development where you put in about 20 houses or something, and you're far enough away from the municipal water, the developer would have put in their own water system, so their own piping and own pumps, things like that. It's actually more common than I first thought. So, yeah. Yes.
If they become a fire district, they become like a little sub-village water system.
Basically.
And then you have Woodstock was in the news where they were a public water supply, a private company, and once they go public, then they're bought by the municipality, you lose oversight.
That's correct. Yep. All right. I want to talk about some general principles about regulation. I'm doing three most significant to me that I've seen come up the most over the years. Least cost planning. So generally, first you ensure that safety, and I'm thinking in particular electric and natural gas are the two main utilities that are subject to least cost planning. Per statute, the only one subject to least cost planning. So you ensure that the provision of service is safe and it's reliable. Quick side note, the definition of reliability has been changing over time. It used to be, you just sort of accepted that with flicker, that's less and less acceptable. And now with major storms, how much does the utility need to do to prevent major storm or destruction of infrastructure from major storms? So I put it in here as sort of a throwaway, and it's not. There's a lot of issues associated with reliability. But generally, when we talk about least cost planning, it's meeting the need for energy services, electric or natural gas, at the lowest cost. Here, when we define costs, though, it includes environmental costs as well. So you have to factor in, and statute specifically talks about greenhouse gas emissions and costs of climate change. So when we say lowest cost, it's not like we don't care about the environmental aspects. We're actually incorporating that into the definition. So statute requires all the electric utilities and Vermont Gas to do an integrated resource plan at least every 3 years. And that they're effectively saying, here's what we're going to do to provide service to our customers over the next 10 to 20 years. Theoretically, it's 20 years, but we really look at the next 10 years.
You just, one more time, the integrated resource planning.
Yep.
It's every 3 years. They have to do a plan that looks out 20 years.
Yes.
And you have to approve them?
We have to approve integrated resource plan. I will also say that there's a fair number of other states that have this kind of requirement, and different states, the statutes are very different. I was talking to a commissioner from Missouri a while back. He said the integrated resource plan proceedings are their most significant proceedings, everyone shows up because the utility cannot build anything unless it's specifically enumerated in their integrated resource plan. And they're very strict about that. They can't incur additional costs unless it's in their integrated resource plan. We do not have that same level of, I was going to say rigor, but it sounds like we don't hold our utilities to that same level. In other words, if they think of something that's actually benefits ratepayers and it wasn't in their IRP, if it makes sense to us, we'll let them do it. So,
They have to propose it to you.
they would have to propose it. Yep. Another important aspect of least cost planning, you have to look at all available, reasonably available alternatives. And what we try to do here is a balance of resources. You don't want 100% of the resources to be the lowest cost, because then you turn into reliability issues, supply chain issues, and everything else. You want a balance of different resources and capabilities available to the utility. So IRP sounds like a science, but it really is, it's balance and trade-offs. Another important principle, prices need to reflect costs. And this gets back to the idea of monopoly utilities. They have captive customers. In theory, you can go off grid, and definitely some people go off grid and are no longer an electric customer. It's a serious commitment to be able to do that. Vast majority of Vermonters are on grid and they're captive customers to their electric utility.
Yeah.
If I could just highlight one thing about that. As I understand it, Vermont is so we all used to have, all the states used to have monopoly utilities, where that is the case. But Vermont is the only one in New England that still has that, is that right?
So,
because other states have what they call retail competition. So they separate distribution from transmission. So
that's true to a certain degree. It's called retail choice. We're the only state in the Northeast that does not have retail choice. In every other state in the Northeast, you can actually say, I don't want Green Mountain Power. I want this company X because they have better marketing, better other things, this kind of stuff. And so you switch onto that provider. The reason I'm saying it's not 100% accurate is that Green Mountain Power is still providing the distribution infrastructure. And so those costs are still paid regardless of what retail choice you have. You're not completely divorced from the costs associated with the underlying monopoly provision of service. You're choosing more on what specific resources that company has contracted with.
So other states still have monopoly distribution. It's just there are other sort of features about it that you can select and that customers can choose from. Okay.
Yeah, most other states, or any state that has retail choice, you're going to see two significant sections of your bill. One is sort of, I think it's usually called distribution charge or T&D charge, just transmission distribution charge. And that reflects sort of the monopoly piece of here's how much it costs to provide the wires and this basic service to you. And then on top of that is the retail choice. And that does reflect more of the power supply characteristics of a particular retail utility.
Okay. And are other states' rates do they fluctuate much more dramatically than our rates do in Vermont?
Yes. A couple of years ago, 10 years ago now, the polar vortex, Vermont's rates barely budged at all associated with that. And there was a couple of utilities in Massachusetts that saw 50% rate increases because they had short-term contracts. So that's what you do if you're a retail provider. You're not thinking 20 years out, you're thinking sort of 5 years out at the most. So.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. What was I? So because you have these captive customers, the rates that these customers pay should really reflect the cost to actually serve those customers. you can include the societal benefits associated with delivery. And here, for example, renewable energy standard, that incurs some costs. And so that is allowed to be mixed in with the retail cost for the utility electric service. From several years back, there was a farm methane project. Farm methane projects actually have this really interesting benefit of they reduce phosphorus. And so one utility was making the argument that look at this great benefit to water quality by reducing phosphorus, so we should pay more for this farm methane project then. And we said, no, that's great. If you want clean water, there's already mechanisms for doing that. You should not be collecting those costs through electric rates. So that's sort of a distillation of that basic principle. The cost should be within that sector. Another important component too of just utilities, and this is a constitutional, US Supreme Court has said this, they have to have the opportunity to recover all reasonably incurred costs from ratepayers. In other words, you can't tell a utility, we want you to do X and we want you to absorb the costs and not pass it on to ratepayers. It's just, we cannot do that. It wouldn't happen. Everything you tell the utilities to do, ratepayers pay for. Had this conversation on disconnects as well, where people say, oh, it's the utility that's absorbing these costs. No, it's not. All of your other ratepayers are absorbing the costs of you not paying your bill.
I'm thinking about California, and what about when utilities haven't done something they were supposed to do, and there's a huge public liability as a result?
In terms of who pays the cost there, so it should be the utility that actually incurs the cost in that particular, because they should have known better. Then it gets into an interesting issue of, are those reasonably anticipated events? This then becomes just a litigation issue, but all reasonably anticipated events and all reasonably incurred costs should be incurred by the utility. Great.
So, yeah. We're talking about electricity, and you mentioned Green Mountain Power.
Mm-hmm.
Is Green Mountain Power the only investor-owned utility left in the state?
Green Mountain Power is the only investor-owned electric. Otherwise, it is 14 municipals and 2 cooperative. So all the other electric utilities are nonprofits.
DC and Washington Electric Co-op, and that's 14 munis and Green Mountain Power.
Yep, that's correct. And Vermont Gas is investor-owned as well. So, all right. I wish there was a better term for this, but cost or pays. Basically, whoever adds costs to the system must pay for those costs. We actually just did a report last week as well on electric vehicle rates, and one of the aspects that we were requested to report on is who pays for the upgrades necessary when you have enough critical mass of people putting in EVs. So generally, if there's an infrastructure upgrade cost, it is, and these are, for example, line extension for a remote home, like out in the middle of nowhere, or transformer upgrades. And I'm thinking it could be anything from the small pole-mounted transformer that needs to be upgraded because of somebody's EV to the entire substation because the ski area is putting in, a bunch of new snow guns, something like that. What we have believed almost always required is that the utility look at the revenues from the increased load. So if you're adding a bunch of snow guns, if you're adding EVs, it means you're actually getting additional revenue because you're selling more electricity. And if those increased revenues are greater than the cost of the upgrade, then it's actually all ratepayers who are benefiting, and therefore the costs of those upgrades should be socialized. Yes.
Could you talk just a little bit more about a line extension for a remote home? So if I live way up and out somewhere. Who pays for that?
Yeah, that is typically the customer who's building the home. And I will also say, because I worked on this almost 20 years ago, it also reflected a policy at the time that you did not want to encourage sprawl. And therefore, to having that additional cost of providing service was a way of minimizing sprawl. So there was an underlying policy that was sort of mixed in with this general principle about cost pays as well.
Interesting.
Because it is an interesting question of, depending on how far out that remote home is, still increased electric revenues.
Yeah.
There's also somewhat complicated formula. If you build a home a mile away from the nearest distribution line, you connect in, you pay the full cost. But then if other people build homes between you and the distribution line over the next 5 or 7 years, those people then contribute the costs and contribute to those costs and reduce the cost for the initial homeowner.
Gotcha.
Yeah. If I could just ask, does it matter whether you're on a private road or a public road?
It does not. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about PUC proceedings.
Sorry.
Yes.
Can I ask one question? So on the cost causer?
Yeah.
So it's just the last guy in that is paying?
So there's a distinction between, on the generation side and load side. Here, what I've been talking about is just load, not generation. On the generation side, it is the last person in pays. And the distinction between generation and load is that load increases the amount of revenues through increased kilowatt hour sales. Generation does not provide those additional revenues. It provides, so it's
Just
not
using the system
exactly,
for profit.
presumably.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great. So I'm going to first talk about who actually shows up in cases. We have some automatic parties. So obviously the petitioner, whoever's asking us to do something, is an automatic party. Department of Public Service appears in every single proceeding that we have. Agency of Natural Resources is automatic party to every siting case. So any generation, transmission, battery storage, any of that. And then Ag Agency in certain cases, sort of a threshold on size and whether or not primary ag soils are implicated. Interveners, yes.
I think you're about to say, go, sorry.
So, interveners, this is anybody who's not an automatic party can move to intervene in the case. They can say, we have an interest in the outcome, and therefore you should let us participate as well.
And what are the criteria for deciding whether can anybody be an intervener? All you have to do is move and it's automatically accepted, or are there some criteria for saying you don't really have standing here?
Yeah, it really has to do with what is their interest, and is their interest protected by one of the statutory parties? And that last piece has been a little bit sort of in flux over time, because theoretically between DPS and ANR, they actually, in theory, do represent all of Vermonters when it comes to environmental issues and public interest issues. But we have, generally, if a neighboring landowner moves to intervene, a landowner who's neighboring or adjoins a generation project, we have typically let them intervene, and it's pretty straightforward. Environmental groups have typically intervened as well because they have interests that are a little bit different, and a little bit different than sort of public interest in terms of what the department represents. They're representing their specific take on what the potential environmental impacts of a decision could be. So I can bring in the rule at some point and point exactly to the language, but generally And I believe that we ought to be somewhat permissive when it comes to intervention, especially when it comes to citing cases as well. I will also say that when you have very complicated rate cases, very few people intervene. Most people just are not that, not sadistic, but that's a good thing. Thank you.
Right.
Municipalities and regional planning commissions. So on any citing case, they actually receive advance notice. So 45 days before the developer files, they have to tell the towns, here's what we're thinking about doing. And the intent really is so that way the towns can talk to the developer. It doesn't always happen. A lot of towns only meet once a month and might not be able to do it. So, but that's the underlying intent of this sort of pre-filing. Yes.
Well, I wanted to ask a question about municipalities that have enhanced energy plans.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly they have more standing.
It's not so much that they have more standing, it's that they have certain land conservation measures that are contained in their plans. And those are specific to this particular area we really want protected for these reasons. And these other areas are where we want to see development of generation. So it's called substantial deference if they have an approved enhanced energy plan. And then there are circumstances, every regional planning commission has an approved enhanced energy plan, not every municipality. So those towns where there isn't an approved enhanced energy plan, we give due consideration to the planning standards.
So substantial deference if they have an approved enhanced energy plan, due consideration if they don't?
That's correct.
Okay.
So municipalities and RPCs also have statutory right to, if they choose to intervene, we will always say yes to them. And they can always file public comments. Adjoining landowners, they also receive this advance notice, can file public comments, they can move to intervene, and then anybody who wants can file public comments or move to intervene. Different categories of proceedings that we have, contested cases. So we're a regulatory body that has the powers of a court. And so when we act in contested cases, and this involves all siting projects, rate cases, actually a large majority of what we do are through contested cases. And there it's very formal, it's a court-like process. We have anybody who moves to intervene and anybody who becomes a party has the opportunity to request an evidentiary hearing. Decisions have to be based on sworn evidence in the record, and ex parte discussions are prohibited. So I can't talk about any contested cases. Nobody on the commission should be talking to anybody about that case. Process-wise is fine, but we can't talk about substance. Uncontested cases, we've used this a lot for sort of investigations or to understand specific issues. It's much more informal. We typically do this through workshops or in comments. And there's no ex parte prohibition on uncontested cases or on rulemakings. So clean heat standard, example of a rulemaking, a little bit different than normal in terms of legislative requirement or approval was required. But we also have done rulemakings on interconnection, net metering, renewable energy standard, typically 18-month process, and we have to follow the Administrative Procedures Act and Secretary of State requirements associated with rulemaking, and actually also the APA when it comes to contested cases as well.
That's a good question on that, and decisions of the commission are final.
Decisions are final and appealable to the Supreme Court. So it's very different than, citing is very different than other situations where somebody can appeal to the environmental court and then from the environmental court to the Supreme Court. We also get significant deference at the Supreme Court in turn when it comes to areas of our expertise. So citing, anybody who receives authorization to site generation or transmission receives what's called a certificate of public good, saying that this project actually promotes the public good of the state of Vermont. Our review is environmental, so some of the Act 250 criteria are actually incorporated. We look at the aesthetic impacts, including Queechy analysis that Act 250 uses as well. We also look at the impact on the electric system, and I'll get into a little bit. For some projects, we look at the impact on repairs as well. Yes.
Is that the sort of a subjective art, or do the different criteria have, is there like a point system? Do environmental weigh more than aesthetic? Does this, how do you guys do this?
It's a great question. So overall, we have to find that the project promotes the general good. And then there's, in certain criteria, it says the project may not or cannot have an undue adverse effect on some of the environmental criteria. It cannot have an undue adverse effect on system stability and reliability. So if we find that a project does have an undue adverse effect on aesthetics, for example, we're going to say no. Or if it's going to have an undue adverse effect on system stability, we'll say no. But generally, the public good piece does allow us to do a fair amount of balancing as well. It could be that a project has some significant negatives and the overall societal benefits outweigh those specific negatives. In theory, we don't very often do that.
Yeah, so what happens when your assessment of aesthetics are different than like the local folks who have approved the project at the local level?
Yeah.
Not that that's ever happened. Theoretically.
Yeah, this is the, we're the ones who decide what the aesthetic impact is, rather than, for example, the municipality might say, we think this is a terrible idea and it has terrible aesthetic impacts, and we have full authority to say, that's great, we don't agree with you, and we're approving the project.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. Yep. That's the way the statute is constructed.
Right, but to get to Chairwoman's question, is there something written out on what the aesthetic criteria are, or is that just subjective based on who's on the commission at the time?
There's something called the Queechy analysis, which lays out the steps for aesthetics review. It was something that Act 250, I think, adopted that test, the Queechy test.
Queechy like the
town, exactly. I believe it was 1990s was when they adopted the Queechy test. And it looks at first whether there's an adverse aesthetic effect. To look at basically the fit within the context of what the project will look like within the existing context of what the visual environment looks like at that particular moment. Mm-hmm. If you find that it is adverse, then you start looking at, do they take all reasonably available mitigation measures? Is it consistent with the specific land conservation measures of the municipal and regional planning commissions? And because I'm on the spot, I forgot. Oh, is it shocking? Could it be shocking and offensive to the average person? And that's the one that the objective test, I cannot say with a straight face, that is applied equally by every single person who's ever used the Queechy test.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
All right. Another important thing about citing, the entire citing construct was actually developed a long time ago, back when the only projects developed were developed by the utilities. And I mentioned earlier that we're one of the few states that regulates siting for every single generation project. Most other states, including the ones who have retail choice, they decided to move away and actually have local zoning for smaller scale projects. And smaller scale depends on individual state. So some small scale renewable generation is conditionally exempt from some of the criteria. Not the environmental or the system stability, but there's criteria about, is there a need for this particular project? Does this project provide economic benefits to the state? Sorry, I thought I had this in the very next. And that's essentially because we have standard offer program. If their project was approved under the standard offer program, we're not going to relitigate the standard offer program every single time a project comes in. We basically say this project came in under an approved program, so we're not going to look at economic benefit. We're not going to look at the rates because the standard offer program set the rates. We're not going to look for need or look at need. So that's some of the why that caveat about certain small scale renewable generation doesn't necessarily have to tick every single box. Just reflects the underlying policy we have for why we want specific small scale renewable. Within energy siting, we actually have a couple different things. We have some streamlined processes. We have full 248 processes. When we have a full 248, it typically involves, especially large scale ones, it's heard directly by the commission. We do a site visit, public hearing. We almost always have evidentiary hearings, sworn testimony, cross-examination of witnesses, all of that. Smaller projects are typically they're limited size and scope. The review is quicker. And sort of the next point here, modified review on certain criteria. I already talked about that. And then for net metering, recognizing that a lot of these projects are just put on somebody's roof, we've done it in a way that's essentially a 10-day registration. Somebody goes online, inputs a form, and they get a registration saying they're allowed to build on their roof or very small scale. And there's 10 days for the utility to object or for joining lenders to object.
So if somebody's gonna put a rooftop system on, the neighbor can take issue?
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen that be successful. And actually, I will double check and make sure that adjoining landowners can object to rooftop solar. I believe that theoretically is possible. I don't think I've seen it though.
I don't remember receiving notice of abutters, but
I'll check into that.
5 minutes.
All right.
Sorry,
No.
getting the 5 of this committee, we should be allowing more time for everything. It's
good.
me, I'm part of the problem. So let's move.
All right.
Questioner.
Energy efficiency utilities, Efficiency Vermont, Burlington Electric Department does their own efficiency. This is essentially back in the late 90s, we decided that this is under the rubric of least cost planning, utilities should be providing energy efficiency services. And that's largely because back then load growth was increasing significantly. As you increase load growth, it means you have to build out your transmission and distribution infrastructure. If you implement cost-effective energy efficiency, you minimize the need to build out the system, and therefore you reduce the overall cost to the system. Problem was that you had, actually back in the late 90s, it was closer to 20-something utilities. And so late 90s was consolidated to third-party provider of energy efficiency, and this is how Efficiency Vermont came about. Talked about this a little bit last week. Funded through energy efficiency charge. Every 3 years, we do a demand resources proceeding. We review a potential study prepared by usually Department of Public Service, might be Efficiency Vermont nowadays, look at what is all cost-effective energy efficiency out there. We then set a budget and quantitative performance indicators. We tell the Efficiency Vermont, you have to achieve X number of megawatt hours savings, you have to achieve this portion within low-income households, like these kind of things. We set clear parameters for them. Energy efficiency charge has to be trued up on an annual basis. This just reflects the fact that electric load just varies every single year, depending on weather. It's a 3-year cycle for the budget and the quantitative performance indicators and regular reporting as well. So rate case is a standard that is used all across the country, and at federal level, rates have to be just and reasonable. Again, this isn't exactly the most concrete standard out there, but it provides a lot of flexibility. Also, different customer classes pay prices that reflect the cost of serving those kind of customers, which is why you have residential rates and then commercial and industrial. A large industrial user uses significantly more kilowatt hours than a residential, and therefore some of their infrastructure costs are actually lower, so they typically pay lower rates than residential. We're also starting to see flexible and managed loads become their own almost customer classes. So EV rates in particular, or Green Mountain Power will manage the charging of your electric vehicle. You get decreased rate if you participate in that program, only for the kilowatt hours associated with charging the vehicle. I'm just going to skip over traditional and alt-reg, getting in the weeds. I do want to note rate cases are very time intensive for utilities. Specifically, for example, Hyde Park is one of the smaller utilities. If we open an investigation into Hyde Park, that can actually cause an upward shift because now they're hiring lawyers doing everything else. Very different than PEC or Green Mountain Power. They actually have the capability. I'm not saying they love having rate cases, but it's a differential impact. And then rulemakings, we have broad authority to initiate rulemakings. Unlike a couple other agencies where they have to be told, you need to do a rulemaking on X, Y, or Z. Somewhere in statute, I didn't find it this morning, it's just PUC may do whatever rules it needs to, effectuate the statute. So I mentioned earlier, Administrative Procedures Act, Secretary of State requirements, and we have well over a dozen, probably at least 18 different rules at the moment. So lots of rules available.
Yeah.
Does PUC have any jurisdiction over the KWH rates of EV networks? Not through utilities, but through other companies, ChargePoint and I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm hesitating only because there was a bill maybe 5 years ago that specifically talked about the state's jurisdiction over these sort of third-party chargers and said we ought to allow competition, and I believe limited to some degree, but those customers are still, those ChargePoint and others are still paying Green Mountain Power, the electric utility, for their rates. So presumably there is a tariff in place for those third-party chargers.
What I remember from a few years ago is those companies were not allowed to charge by the kilowatt hour. They had to charge by the hour or something like that, because charging for a kilowatt hour was restricted to regular utilities. So that we did that change, but I don't remember what happened as far as the rates, whether there's any. You have any jurisdiction over the rates?
Well, we have jurisdiction over the tariffs that are offered by the utility, and the tariffs include the tariffs that might be specific to a third-party charging station, like or owner, like ChargePoint.
But what ChargePoint or whoever adds onto that?
Oh, I'm sorry. We do not have any jurisdiction over what ChargePoint charges their customers. Yeah, my apologies.
Does anybody?
I don't believe so.
Yeah. Thanks.
Final question, yes.
The efficiency charge, is it uniform throughout the whole state? Like on residential, is Burlington paying the same rate I'm paying?
So because Burlington is not part of Efficiency Vermont, they're the only carve out of the entire statewide Efficiency Vermont programs. The City of Burlington Electric Department provides their own services. But otherwise, outside of Burlington, everyone else pays the same energy efficiency charge. And Burlington pays an energy efficiency charge as well. Those folks do. It's just not typically the same as efficiency.
Okay, I'm sure we will see you here again. Thank you so much for coming. Folks, follow up with any questions, and we have to be in the pavilion at 2:30.